What do you do when a gorgeous neighbor texts that a tall, muscular stranger just came to your wife's door, and you're out of town with nothing but a phone, a timestamp, and the sick feeling that the truth will cost you everything? My name is Graham Hale, and I have learned that panic is a luxury for people who can afford mistakes. I was 3 states away in a hotel that smelled like bleach and warm carpet glue, trying to pretend a business trip still meant something. The day had been a tight loop of meetings, polite nods, and cheap coffee that tasted like burnt paper. I should have been tired enough to sleep without thinking, but my mind kept replaying small things from home, like a door left ajar, or a smile that lingered a second too long. When you live with someone long enough, you stop listening to their words and start listening to the silence around them. That night, the silence reached me before anything else did. My phone lit up on the bedside table, bright enough to cut the dark in half. I reached for it with the lazy confidence of a man expecting an airline update or a calendar reminder. The screen showed a new message from Voss, our neighbor, the kind of woman people notice even when they are pretending not to. She was gorgeous in that clean, effortless way that made other women adjust their posture and men forget their sentences. I did not text her often, and she did not text me at all, which made the notification feel like a loose floorboard creaking at midnight. The message was short, sharp, and careful, like she had measured every word for weight and damage. "Not my business," she wrote, "but a tall, muscular guy just came to your wife." I stared at the screen until my eyes stopped blinking. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, thick and slow, like something trying to climb out. The first instinct was to call my wife, to demand an explanation, to squeeze the truth out by force of volume. That instinct was useless, and I knew it, because I had watched men destroy their own cases with nothing but righteous noise. I had spent years in insurance claims, sorting lies from facts, watching people turn one bad decision into 5 crimes by talking too much. A liar's best friend is chaos, and a betrayed man is chaos with a pulse. I set the phone down, breathed in, and told myself that whatever happened next would happen on my terms. I picked the phone back up and typed with steady thumbs. I told Mara I was out of town and asked if she could help. I kept the words clean, not begging, not accusing, not dramatic. I needed her to stay inside the moment, not get spooked by my emotions. She replied fast, which meant she was still awake and still watching. She said I could count on her, and in that sentence I felt something change, like a hinge moving. People think betrayal is always loud, but sometimes it starts as a polite offer from the right person at the wrong time. I read her reply twice and let my face go blank again. I asked what she saw, and she answered with details that were both ordinary and damning. She said the guy was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed like someone who liked mirrors, and he carried himself like he belonged. She said he did not look lost or hesitant, which mattered more than his height. She said he arrived quickly, as if he had timed his entrance, and she saw my wife open the door without surprise. That last part sat in my stomach like a stone. If my wife had been startled, I could have built 1,000 innocent explanations. If she opened the door like she had been waiting, then innocence had already packed its bag. I asked if Mara could do one thing for me, something simple and clean. I asked her to check whether my doorbell camera had caught the entrance and the time. It faced my doorway, not the hallway, and that mattered because I had no interest in spying on anyone but myself. Mara told me she could see the little camera over my frame, and she could hear its chime when it triggered. She said she had heard it a few minutes ago, and she had looked through her peephole without opening her own door. She told me the man had come in and the hallway had gone quiet after. I did not ask her to follow him, and I did not ask her to record anything. I did not need a hero, and I did not need an accomplice. I needed a witness who could be calm. After that, the room around me changed color. The hotel was still the hotel, but now it felt like a holding cell built out of polite lighting. I could hear the air conditioner cycling, clicking like a metronome, as if it wanted to keep time for my humiliation. I walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot, where cars sat under yellow lamps like abandoned toys. Somewhere in my own home, my wife was not alone, and the distance between us was suddenly a weapon aimed at my spine. People think distance protects them, but it really just gives betrayal space to stretch out. I pressed my forehead to the glass and let the cold remind me that I was still a person. The worst part was not the image of a stranger in my doorway. The worst part was how quickly my mind tried to fill in everything else, the small, private details that made the image feel real. I pictured my wife smoothing her hair, shifting her weight, letting her face settle into the expression she used when she wanted something. I pictured the man stepping inside with the confidence of someone who had been invited more than once. I pictured the door closing and the bolt turning, and I could almost hear it, a soft click that sounded like a decision. My throat tightened, but my hands stayed steady, because I refused to become the story's clown. I returned to the bed and opened the Notes app on my phone. I created a new entry and titled it with the date, the city, and the time, because my brain trusted structure more than feelings. I wrote down what Mara said, exactly, without commentary. I wrote down the phrases that mattered, like without surprise and arrived quickly and doorbell triggered. I wrote down my own location and why I was there, because later someone would ask, and I wanted the answer to be precise. This was not a diary entry meant to comfort me. This was an evidence ledger meant to outlast me. If I was going to drown, I was going to leave a clear waterline. I considered calling my wife again, just to hear her voice and measure the temperature. I imagined her answering with a brightness that did not fit the hour. I imagined the quick lie she would choose, the kind of lie people tell when they think the truth is too expensive. She might say she had been sorting laundry, or that she had fallen asleep early, or that she had ordered delivery. She might even tell the truth, but only the safe half, the half that kept her hands clean. I knew how this worked, because I had listened to couples in conference rooms talk about broken cars and missing receipts, when the real story was always the same. Someone wanted something, and they thought they could get it without paying. Instead of calling, I texted her a small, normal message about my day. I told her the meeting ran long and I was finally back at the hotel. I told her I would call in the morning because that gave me time and took away her chance to stage a performance on the spot. I watched the typing bubble appear, disappear, then reappear, like her mind was trying on masks. She replied with a cheerful line about being tired and going to bed soon. The words looked polite enough, but the timing did not feel natural. People who are actually tired do not polish their messages. They send sloppy ones and fall asleep. I set the phone down again and sat with my hands on my knees, forcing myself to stay still. I thought about Mara across the hall, and I wondered what she wanted from this moment. Some people help because they are kind, and some people help because they enjoy power. Mara had the kind of beauty that made power look like a hobby, and I had no illusions about how favors worked in a building full of bored adults. Still, she had come to me with a warning instead of a whisper campaign, and that counted for something. I had lived long enough to respect anyone who could choose discretion in a world that rewards spectacle. I texted Mara a final thank you and asked her not to put herself at risk. I told her I only needed what she had already seen. She responded that she understood, and she added a small detail that made my jaw tighten. She said the man carried no bag and wore no coat, which suggested he did not plan to leave quickly. She said my wife had opened the door with her left hand and held it wide, the posture of a host, not a startled spouse. It was a domestic detail, and those are the sharpest kind. It told me this was not a mistake that just wandered in. It told me my home had become a meeting place. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, where a faint water stain looked like a map. I traced the stain with my eyes and tried to imagine what the next 30 days could look like. I could confront her and watch her deny, cry, blame stress, and promise change with wet eyes. I could forgive her and spend the rest of my life swallowing bile at random moments, like hearing a doorbell. Or I could do what I did best, which was build a case so clean that it left no room for interpretation. People think revenge is about cruelty, but I had always preferred precision. The truth, applied repeatedly in small, lawful doses, can destroy a lie faster than any scream. I checked the time and realized it was past midnight. The city outside was quieter now, and my room felt too small for the thoughts it held. I stood up and walked the length of the carpet, counting steps like it could make me calmer. I reminded myself of rules I had learned the hard way. Do not confront without proof. Do not threaten what you cannot execute. Do not give your enemy a warning shot. Betrayal thrives on ambiguity, and the only antidote is documentation. I did not need to know what happened behind that door tonight. I needed to know enough to collapse whatever story she planned to tell tomorrow. I picked up my phone and opened the doorbell app, hoping the system would show a clip, but the building's connection sometimes lagged when I was away. The loading circle spun like a mocking smile. I could feel frustration rising, but I kept it down because technology is never a partner, only a tool. I sent myself a reminder to retrieve the footage the moment I got home, and I wrote that down too, because memory is a traitor when emotions are hot. I also wrote a simple note to check my accounts for any unusual merchant alerts, because affairs leave traces that have nothing to do with romance. They leave receipts, missed calls, and schedule friction that can be measured. In the dark, I thought about my wife's face, the version of it I knew, and the version she might be showing someone else. I thought about how intimacy can become a weapon when someone stops respecting the person across the table. I thought about the old arguments we had avoided by pretending they did not matter, the small resentments that stack up like mail you never open. I did not excuse her, but I did not flatter myself either. Betrayal is always a choice, but it often grows in soil both people ignored. Still, the presence of a tall, muscular stranger in my doorway was not a symptom. It was an act. When sleep finally came, it did not arrive like comfort. It arrived like exhaustion, heavy and dull. I dreamed of my front door opening and closing in a loop, each click louder than the last. I woke before dawn with my heart already moving, already planning. The first light in the room made everything look cheap and unforgiving, and my phone sat where I had left it, silent but dangerous. I knew I would smile on my morning call and keep my tone even. I knew I would tell her I missed her and ask something small and neutral. I knew I would listen for the gap between her words and the truth. And I knew, with a calm certainty that felt almost cruel, that the story had already started the moment Mara's message lit my screen. The next move was mine, and I was done being the last person to learn what happened in my own house. The next morning I called Elena with the same voice I used on claimants who swore their wrecked car had been parked all night, because a calm tone makes liars overconfident and sloppy. I asked about her sleep, her plans, and the weather back home, and I listened for a hesitation that did not belong. She said she was tired and had gone to bed early, and I noted that her words arrived too smoothly, as if she had practiced them before the call. I told her my meetings would wrap soon, and I would be home the following evening, and I made sure to sound relieved rather than suspicious. I ended the call without pressing, because pressing is a warning shot, and warning shots teach your target to wear armor. The day crawled through its remaining obligations like a guilty man walking past a line of mirrors. I sat in conference rooms that smelled like dry markers and reheated lunches, and I answered questions with my mouth while my mind ran its own investigation. Between meetings, I checked my phone, not for messages from Elena, but for anything that looked like a crack in routine. There was nothing dramatic, because betrayal rarely announces itself with fireworks, and that is why people miss it for months. I kept my notes app open and added small timestamps, like the exact minute Mara had texted me. And the minute Elena replied with her cheerful bedtime line, I wrote everything down as if I were preparing for a dispute with an insurance board, because feelings cannot be appealed, but documentation can. Mara did not text again, which I appreciated more than I expected. Some people would have poked at the story for entertainment, or tried to sell the next detail as a favor, but she stayed quiet after giving me what she had. That restraint made me trust her just enough to keep her in the perimeter without pulling her into the center. I sent one brief message thanking her again, and I asked her to keep living her normal life, because normal life is what makes a witness credible. She replied with a single line that felt almost amused, and I imagined her reading my message with a half smile that said she understood leverage better than most. I pocketed my phone and returned to pretending I was still a man on a business trip. When I finally drove home the next evening, the highway felt like a long tunnel leading back to a version of my life that no longer existed. I parked in the garage and rode the elevator up with strangers who smelled like detergent and impatience. As the elevator rose, I watched the numbers climb and felt my body tighten, not from fear, but from the discipline of holding myself together. I stepped into the hallway and walked toward my door at a steady pace, because rushing would make my own nerves look like evidence. The hallway lighting was warm and soft, meant to flatter the building and the people inside it, but it made every shadow look like a hiding place. My door looked unchanged, which was the cruelest kind of normal. Elena opened the door before I could knock, which might have been coincidence, but I did not believe in coincidences anymore. She hugged me with a practiced warmth and kissed my cheek, and I let my arms return the gesture without tightening. Her perfume was the same, but the timing of it felt different, like it had been applied with intention rather than habit. I carried my bag inside and scanned the entryway with the lazy eyes of a husband who had nothing to suspect. The living room was tidy, the lights were set to their usual dim level, and the air smelled faintly of a candle she liked. I noted the candle because people light candles for ambiance, and they also light them to erase odors. I asked about her day while I unpacked, and she told me she had been busy, and she offered details that were plentiful but oddly generic. She mentioned errands, work emails, and a headache that came and went, and I heard the faint rhythm of a story that had been assembled rather than lived. I nodded and kept my face neutral, because sarcasm is only useful when it stays inside your head. While she talked, I walked to the kitchen sink and washed my hands, and I watched the counter for any object that looked out of place. Nothing jumped at me, and that meant one of two things. Either nothing happened, or she cleaned with purpose. A clean house after a secret visit is not proof, but it is a smell in the air. Later, when Elena went to shower, I sat at the dining table with my phone and opened the doorbell app. The feed loaded this time, and the familiar view of my doorway filled the screen like a surveillance photo from my own trial. I scrolled back to the night Mara texted me, and I found the clip, and my fingers went cold as I watched it. The camera showed only my door and the small wedge of hallway, but that was enough. A tall man stepped into frame, confident and unhurried, and Elena opened the door almost immediately. She did not glance down the hall as if checking for neighbors, and she did not hesitate as if unsure. She leaned slightly into the doorway and let him in, and the door closed behind him with a calm finality. I did not replay the clip more than twice, because obsession blurs details into emotion. I took a still frame that captured the man's shape and the timestamp clearly, and I saved it to a secure folder on my phone. Then I did something boring and necessary, the same thing I would advise any client to do if they wanted their truth to survive scrutiny. I printed the still frame on our small printer, and I wrote the date and time on the back, and I signed it with a simple initial. The paper felt warm when it came out, and I hated that warmth, because it made the moment feel domestic. Proof should feel cold, but sometimes it comes out of a printer in your own home. When Elena came out of the shower, she looked relaxed, as if she believed the danger had passed. She asked if I wanted dinner, and I said yes, and I let the evening move forward with its normal motions. I told her the trip was exhausting, and I mentioned a dull meeting detail, and I watched her eyes for flickers of guilt. She looked at me with what might have been affection, but affection can be performance when it is needed. During dinner, she asked if anything interesting happened while I was away, and I almost laughed at the neatness of her question. I told her nothing unusual happened, and I let the statement hang there like a coin on a table. She did not push further, and that told me she was relieved rather than curious. After dinner, while she answered a work message on her phone, I checked our shared finances with the casual air of a man paying bills. Most of the transactions were normal: groceries and a pharmacy purchase, and a streaming subscription renewal. Then I saw the merchant alert that had pinged my phone while I was away, the one that had bothered me because it was too close to home. The transaction was small enough to look harmless, but it was stamped with a time window that overlapped with the doorbell clip by less than an hour. The location tag in the banking app showed a gym cafe across the street, the kind of place people stop at after workouts or before meetings or after doing something they do not want to rush. I took a screenshot of the merchant alert, making sure the date, amount, and merchant name were visible. I saved it in the same folder as the doorbell still, and I labeled it with a simple code because codes keep emotions from leaking into your filing system. Then I opened a blank document and started a ledger table. Not fancy, just a list of dates, times, locations, and proof items. I typed slowly, forcing myself to treat each entry like an invoice rather than a wound. Under the first entry, I wrote the doorbell timestamp and the still frame file name. Under the second entry, I wrote the merchant alert and its time. It was not a full story yet, but it was the beginning of one, and beginnings are dangerous for liars. Over the next few days, I did not confront Elena, because confrontation is a gift you hand to someone who does not deserve it. Instead, I watched routines like a man watching weather patterns, looking for shifts that signal a storm. Elena started leaving the house a little earlier than usual, and she returned with a brightness that did not match her claimed exhaustion. She mentioned work mentorship once, and she mentioned a project deadline another time, and each explanation sounded plausible until you lined them up side by side. Plausible stories always fall apart when they are forced to share a calendar. I began marking her stated plans in my own notes, not because I needed control, but because I needed consistency. One evening, I asked her about a specific errand she said she ran, and I asked in the tone of a husband trying to be helpful. She gave me the name of a store and a rough time, and I nodded, and I let the moment pass. Later, when she was in another room, I checked a shared calendar view we both used for household reminders, and I noticed a conflict that did not fit her story. There was no appointment, no work block, nothing that would explain why she needed to be gone for 3 hours. I exported the week view as a PDF, because a PDF is harder to edit in your own memory. I saved it alongside the other items, and I wrote the file name into my ledger, with the same dead calm I used for claim numbers. The pressure did not come from any single piece of evidence, but from the way Elena started acting as if she were managing an audience. She asked casual questions about my schedule more often, and she offered to handle small chores she normally ignored, like she was trying to buy silence with usefulness. She touched my arm when she passed behind my chair, and she laughed at jokes that were not funny, and she wanted me to look at her, as if eye contact could erase timestamps. I played my role well, because a man who looks suspicious becomes easy to blame, and blame is the first shelter people run to when their lies crack. I kept my sarcasm inside, and I kept my affection consistent enough to make her relax. Mara and I crossed paths in the hallway once, and she greeted me with a friendly smile that could have meant anything. Elena greeted her too, and Elena's smile was polite, but it did not reach her eyes. That small change told me Elena knew Mara had seen something, even if she did not know exactly what. After we went back inside, Elena made a casual comment about neighbors being nosy these days, and I said nothing, because silence is an answer that forces people to fill the space themselves. That night, Elena checked the peephole twice before leaving for a short walk, and I pretended not to notice. When people start watching the watchers, they are already afraid. By the end of the week, I had a small stack of documented proof, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just clean fragments that did not belong together in an innocent life. A doorbell still with a stranger at my threshold, a merchant alert from my account aligned with the same night, a calendar export that showed empty hours where she claimed obligations. Each item alone could be argued away by a skilled liar, but the pattern was a chain, and chains do not care about tears. I slept lightly and woke early, not because I was anxious, but because my mind had shifted into a kind of clinical focus. I could feel the moment approaching when Elena would make her next move, and I wanted to be ready. On Sunday night, she said she had a late work call and needed quiet, and she took her phone to the bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the couch and looked at the printed doorbell still I had hidden in a folder, and I wondered how long she believed her performance could last. Then my phone buzzed with a small notification, the kind that would mean nothing to most people, and I felt my mouth go dry. The alert was another merchant ping, another ordinary purchase, and another time window that fit too neatly into her claimed private call. I saved it, updated the ledger, and stared at the quiet hallway leading to our bedroom. The proof was growing, and I could already see the shape of the trap forming, even before she realized she was walking into it. Monday arrived with the kind of bright, indifferent morning that makes betrayal feel even more insulting, because the world keeps functioning while your private life starts leaking. Elena moved through the kitchen with a smooth efficiency, packing a lunch she did not use to pack, checking her phone more often than she used to check it, and smiling at me as if a smile could reset the last 10 days. I watched her the way I watched claimants in an office chair, not because I enjoyed suspicion, but because I had learned that truth shows up in habits before it shows up in words. She kissed my cheek, grabbed her bag, and left a few minutes earlier than her normal routine. The door clicked shut, and the apartment felt quieter than it had any right to be. I sat at the table and opened the ledger document I had created, the one that held dates and times like a spine. I added the latest merchant alert from the previous night, because patterns become undeniable when you refuse to let them blur into emotion. I wrote down the exact minute the notification arrived, the merchant name, and the amount, and I noted how it overlapped with her claimed late work call window. I did not label it as proof of an affair, because labels are how people poison their own case. I labeled it as a time conflict, because time conflicts do not care about feelings. Then I printed the updated ledger page and placed it into a clear sleeve, because paper has a way of making your decisions feel final. The hardest part was continuing to live beside her without acting like a man who had discovered a fire in his own walls. I still made coffee, still answered work emails, still nodded through her casual updates about her day, and I still did not confront her. Confrontation would give her a chance to clean more thoroughly, to rehearse more carefully, and to recruit sympathy from the right people. I could already see the outline of how she would frame me if I stumbled, because I had watched it happen in too many disputes. She would say I was controlling, she would say I was paranoid, and she would say my coldness proved I had pushed her away. People love a story where the betrayed spouse becomes the villain, because it lets the cheater keep their dignity. I was not going to donate my dignity to her narrative. That afternoon, while I worked from home, I heard the elevator doors open down the hall and the faint rhythm of footsteps that did not sound like Elena's. I did not rush to the peephole because rushing is how you turn yourself into a suspect. Instead, I let 2 minutes pass, then stood and walked toward my door as if I were stretching my legs. I looked through the peephole and saw the hallway empty, which meant someone had already gone inside a unit. The timing was wrong for a delivery, and the footsteps had been too confident for a lost visitor. My mouth tightened, but I forced my face to stay neutral, because a neutral face keeps your brain from lying to itself. I returned to my desk and waited for the doorbell camera to record what it was designed to record, which was my doorway, not the building. When Elena came home later, she carried herself like someone stepping onto a stage, light and controlled. She talked about work in broad strokes, mentioned a deadline, and asked me a question about my week that felt too careful. Her phone stayed in her hand more than it used to, and when a notification lit the screen, she angled it away as if the gesture were automatic. That angle was a small betrayal in itself, because it said she was thinking about what I might see. I did not reach for her phone, and I did not demand access, because I had no interest in being cast as the invasive husband. If she wanted to hide, she could hide, but the hiding would create friction, and friction creates evidence. I smiled, made a dry joke about corporate life, and watched her shoulders relax in relief. After dinner, while Elena showered again with the same new enthusiasm for cleanliness, I opened the doorbell app and checked the afternoon timeline. The clip was there, and it showed exactly what Mara had warned me about in the beginning, only this time I was watching it from inside my own home. A tall, muscular man entered the frame, paused for a half-second, then stepped closer, as if he knew the angle of the camera and did not care. Elena opened the door within seconds, and the way she moved told me she had been listening for his approach. She let him in, and the door closed, and the timestamp sat on the corner of the screen like a judge. I took a still frame again, captured the timestamp, and saved it alongside the first one, because 2 visits are not an accident. 2 visits are a schedule. I printed the new still and slid it into a second clear sleeve, then stacked it behind the first, because my mind needed to see the sequence physically. The sleeves made the paper look clinical, like evidence in a meeting rather than a memory in a marriage. I wrote the date and time on the back, and I initialed it again, because chain of custody is not only for courtrooms, it is for anyone who intends to stay sane. Then I returned to the living room and sat down, and I waited for Elena to finish her shower, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, because rage makes men sloppy. I had seen sloppy men lose everything in negotiations, not because they were wrong, but because they were loud. I refused to become loud. The next move had to be a small truth placed in the right place, and the right place was always a public routine spot, because public routines generate neutral confirmation without effort. The merchant alerts pointed toward a cafe near the building, and the timing suggested the lover was not coming here only for Elena. He was coming here because the neighborhood was part of his cover, and cover stories always require external props. I decided to test that prop without turning it into a spectacle. The following morning, I walked to the cafe across the street as if I were simply stretching my legs and buying coffee. The staff recognized me in the vague way service workers recognize regulars, and that recognition was exactly what I needed. Recognition creates memory, and memory creates a witness. I ordered a coffee and paid with the same card tied to the alerts, because consistency matters. While the receipt printed, I watched the timestamp appear at the bottom, neat and indifferent. I asked for a copy with the same calm politeness I used on any normal errand, and the cashier handed it over without question, because normal men ask for normal things. I stepped outside, held the receipt in my hand, and took a photo of it beside today's date on my phone screen, because a photo with context survives suspicion better than a photo alone. I did not confront anyone, and I did not ask the cashier about Elena, because I was not building gossip. I was building a timeline. Back home, I placed that receipt photo into my folder and updated the ledger with a new line, marking the cafe as a location anchor that connected our finances to a physical place. It was not proof of an affair, but it was proof of a pattern, which mattered more. Elena could claim she met the lover for work mentorship, or networking, or a team-building excuse that sounded respectable. But respectable stories still require schedules, and schedules still leave timestamps. Every time she stepped outside the lane of normal routine, she created a measurable gap. I was collecting those gaps the way a locksmith collects keys, quietly, patiently, and with no interest in drama. That evening, Elena suggested we attend a small gathering later in the week, something casual with friends, and the suggestion was too strategic to be innocent. When people propose social events during a crisis, they are often trying to create public proof of normalcy. If we were seen laughing together, it would become harder for me to be believed later, and easier for her to call me unstable if I ever raised concerns. I told her we could consider it depending on my workload, and I watched her accept the answer with a smile that looked almost disappointed. That disappointment told me she wanted me visible, because visibility is a shield. She did not realize visibility can also become a stage for consequences. The building itself began to feel like a living organism full of eyes. In the elevator, neighbors greeted Elena with the casual warmth reserved for familiar faces, but I noticed subtle pauses when they greeted me. Pauses are where people hide opinions they are not ready to admit. One neighbor asked Elena how her week was going, and she answered with a bright laugh, then glanced at me as if checking my reaction. I gave her nothing, because nothing is the safest response when you are surrounded by soft witnesses. Soft witnesses do not want to take sides, but they remember tone, posture, and timing. If Elena wanted to build an image of a happy marriage, she was doing it too deliberately, and deliberate happiness always looks staged under bright hallway lights. The real pressure hit a few nights later when Elena claimed she had a late meeting that ran long, the kind of meeting that always seems to appear when someone needs a hole in the calendar. She said it casually, but her eyes stayed on my face, searching for a crack. I nodded and told her to take her time, because I wanted her to believe the cover still worked. While she moved around the apartment preparing to leave, her phone buzzed with a notification, and the screen lit up just enough for the lock screen preview to flash a name and a short line before she tilted it away. I saw the name for a fraction of a second, and the name did not belong to any coworker she had ever mentioned. I did not react, but my mind captured it like a camera shutter. After she left, I opened my own phone and checked the doorbell feed again, because the doorbell did not care about her meeting. The camera caught the lover arriving 20 minutes after Elena left, which told me the apartment had become a rendezvous point, even without her present. That detail was not romantic, it was logistical, and logistical affairs are the most dangerous kind, because they treat your life like a resource to be used. I saved the clip still, documented the timestamp, and added it to the growing stack. Then I wrote the lock screen name I had glimpsed into my notes, careful and exact, because partial information becomes powerful when it repeats. The name might be the lover, or it might be the handler, the person shaping the cover. Either way, it was a thread. When Elena returned, she looked pleased with herself, as if the evening had gone according to plan. She told me the meeting had been exhausting, and she apologized for the late hour with a softness that felt like a transaction. I told her it was fine, because I wanted her to keep spending her confidence. Confidence is expensive, and liars run out of it faster than they expect. She went to bed and fell asleep quickly, which was either genuine fatigue or the satisfaction of getting away with something. I stayed up a little longer at the table with my ledger open, adding the new timestamp and the new thread of the lock screen name. The story was tightening, and I could feel the next phase approaching, the phase where evidence stops being private and starts becoming social gravity. Before I turned off the lights, I checked my phone one last time and saw a new notification from Mara, short and carefully timed. She said she had seen the same man again, and she noted the exact minute without adding any commentary. That was not curiosity, and it was not drama because Mara did not ask questions or offer theories. She delivered a timestamp like a professional, and it sent a cold calm through me that felt almost like relief. If this was becoming a routine, then routines can be broken publicly, cleanly, and within 30 days. I closed the ledger, placed the sleeves back into their folder, and went to bed with the strange certainty that Elena was no longer hiding an affair. She was managing a schedule, and schedules are easier to destroy than feelings. By Thursday, the building had started to feel like a place that remembered, because memory is what gossip looks like before it admits it exists. People still smiled at Elena in the elevator, but their smiles began to arrive a half-second late, as if their brains were checking a new file. The doorman who usually joked with me about delivery mix-ups suddenly became formal, and formality is what people choose when they do not want to be quoted. I had not told anyone anything, and that was the point, because I needed the collapse to come from facts, not from my mouth. Still, the moment a routine breaks, the neighborhood notices, because routine is the only currency that keeps strangers polite. Elena seemed to sense the shift as well, and she responded the way skilled performers respond to a restless audience. She became more visible, more social, and more deliberate about being seen with me. She suggested coffee walks at peak hours, and she offered to pick up packages in the lobby while holding my hand, as if touch could rewrite the week. She laughed louder than usual when neighbors passed, and she asked questions about their weekends in a tone that invited connection. I watched it with a cold patience that surprised even me, because it looked less like a marriage and more like an image repair campaign. The sarcasm in my head was sharp, but I kept it behind my teeth, because sarcasm leaks through the eyes. That night, while we sat on the couch pretending to unwind, Elena brought up a dinner with friends for Saturday, framing it as a normal obligation we had neglected. She did not sound nervous, but she sounded strategic, and there is a difference you can hear if you stop wanting to believe. I responded with the kind of mild agreement that buys time without committing, and I watched her shoulders settle with relief. Relief is a tell, because innocent people do not need you to agree to their cover. After she went to the bedroom to change into something comfortable, she left her phone on the counter, screen down, like someone trying to look casual about what they are hiding. The device buzzed once, then lit up, and the lock screen preview flashed long enough for me to catch a name and a fragment. I did not touch her phone, because touching it would turn me into the story she wanted to tell later. Instead, I lifted my own phone from the table and took a clean photo of her screen from where I sat, capturing the preview, the time, and the name in a single frame. The act felt strangely boring, which was how I knew it was correct, because boring evidence is the kind that survives scrutiny. I saved the photo in my folder and labeled it with the date and minute. Then I put my phone face down again. When Elena returned, she picked up her device and tilted it toward her body as if the motion were reflex. Reflexes are learned, and learned reflexes come from repeated risk. The next day I went into the office because I needed a different environment to see the pattern clearly, and because distance inside a city can be as useful as distance across states. My workplace was a standard corporate floor with glass walls and forced cheer, the kind of place that pretends everyone is a family while preparing termination scripts. I sat through a routine meeting and listened to people talk about metrics that meant nothing, and I watched my own attention keep drifting to Elena's phone preview photo. A name, a time, a fragment, and suddenly her late meeting story had a shadow attached to it. Around noon, I walked past the HR corridor by accident, or at least I let it look like an accident, and I noticed a bulletin slide on a monitor near reception. The slide announced a new compliance reminder about fraternization and disclosure, written in the cold language that makes everyone feel guilty without accusing anyone directly. I did not stop long enough to draw attention, but I stopped long enough to absorb the timing. If Elena was involved with someone tied to HR influence, then a compliance reminder might not be routine. It might be preparation, either to protect someone or to prune someone, depending on who needed to stay clean. I had seen organizations do it before, quietly changing policies and re-emphasizing rules right before they chose a scapegoat. The idea settled into my mind like a second stone because it suggested Elena's affair was not only personal. It suggested she was climbing, and the lover was a rung, and the company's narrative machine was the ladder itself. That evening, Elena came home with a new kind of energy, the kind people carry after being validated in public. She talked about a project she had been assigned, and she framed it as an honor, mentioning leadership and trust in the same breath. She also mentioned the name of Vivian Crow once, almost casually, as if Vivian were a distant executive who barely mattered. The casualness was too clean, because people do not mention powerful names without purpose. Elena wanted me to hear it and accept it. The way you accept a weather forecast, you cannot change. I nodded and told her that sounded like a lot of responsibility, and I watched her smile brighten, like she had won a small point. Later, when she went to shower again, I checked the doorbell feed for the previous night and the afternoon while I had been at work. The camera captured no visitor that day, which told me they were adjusting, and adjustments are confirmations in themselves. It also told me someone had warned them to vary their routine, which narrowed my suspicion toward a controlling third party. A lover acting alone might be reckless, but a lover managed by an institution becomes careful. I scrolled back through the week and compared timestamps, noticing a new pattern: shorter visits, tighter windows, fewer triggers for witnesses. That did not make me feel safer. It made me feel certain, because only guilty people begin optimizing their invisibility. Saturday arrived with the friend dinner Elena had proposed, and the apartment felt like it was holding its breath. Elena dressed with an intensity that was not about me, choosing an outfit that looked effortless but required planning. She kept checking her phone, then setting it down, then picking it up again, like she expected a call that would decide something. I offered a neutral compliment and watched her accept it in the way you accept a receipt, briefly, without warmth. Then she asked if I was feeling okay, and her eyes scanned my face with the careful attention of someone looking for weakness. I told her I felt fine, because fine is the word you use when you are building a trap and do not want the other person to smell metal. On the way to the restaurant, she filled the car with casual conversation about friends, schedules, and how we had been so busy lately. Her tone had a gentle narrative arc, the kind you use when you want listeners to adopt a version of events. I let her talk, because people who believe they are controlling the story tend to over-explain, and over-explaining creates contradictions. In the parking lot, she suggested we take a photo together to send to friends, and I agreed, because refusing would look like conflict. The photo was ordinary, but I knew why she wanted it, and that knowledge made my stomach tighten. She wanted proof that we were intact, because intact is the shield she planned to hold up when the truth tried to enter the room. Inside, the restaurant was loud with weekend energy, the kind that makes everyone feel anonymous. We met our friends at a table near the center, and Elena greeted them with a brightness that felt slightly too strong. I watched the faces around us, trying to read whether any of them already knew something, because secrets rarely stay inside the couple who created them. People asked about my trip, about work, about routine things, and Elena answered with ease, slipping small compliments about our marriage into her sentences. The compliments were not for me, they were for the room, like she was laying down a protective layer of consensus. Consensus is fragile, but it is powerful, because it makes later revelations feel like an attack on the group. When a friend asked Elena about her new responsibility at work, her expression shifted in a way that told me she had been waiting for the question. She spoke about leadership, trust, and visibility again, and she mentioned Vivian Crow a second time, making sure everyone heard the name. That was not an accident. It was a signal, because powerful names are meant to intimidate, even when spoken casually. I responded with a small joke about corporate titles and their love of drama, and our friends laughed, and Elena smiled as if I had just helped her. The smile was a private victory, and it made my jaw clench, because she thought my humor was compliance. Halfway through dinner, Elena's phone buzzed on the table, and she flipped it face down quickly, too quickly to look natural. The move was small, but our friend across from her noticed, because people always notice what is slightly too fast. Elena tried to soften it with a laugh and a vague gesture about notifications, but the moment had already left a mark. I did not stare, and I did not ask questions, because I did not need to create a scene. I only needed the room to feel that something was off, because once a room senses tension, it starts watching for proof. Proof becomes easier to land when people are already leaning forward. When we got home, Elena acted unusually affectionate, like she wanted to seal the night with a private display of unity. I gave her what she wanted in measured amounts because denying her would make her suspicious, and indulging her would make me sick. After she finally fell asleep, I returned to the kitchen table and opened the folder on my phone. I looked at the lock screen preview photo again, then the merchant alerts, then the doorbell stills, then the calendar export. The evidence was no longer a handful of fragments. It was a pattern that had begun to describe a second life living inside our first. I added a new line to the ledger for the lock screen preview, noting the time and the name fragment, and I printed the photo and slid it into a sleeve. I also wrote down a simple observation that felt ugly but necessary, that Elena had been deploying public normalcy like a defense strategy. That observation was not evidence, but it was context, and context matters when you are explaining why you did not confront sooner. In my world, people who rush to accuse often lose, and people who wait with documentation tend to win quietly. I was not trying to destroy Elena for sport. I was trying to make sure she could not destroy me with her story. Before I went to bed, I checked the doorbell feed again, and I noticed something that made my pulse slow rather than spike. The lover had not shown up all weekend, which suggested coordination, not passion. It suggested someone had told them to pause while Elena rebuilt her public image. That was the moment my mind stopped treating the affair as a simple betrayal and started treating it as a managed operation. The late meetings, the buzzed notifications, the controlled mentions of Vivian, and the sudden need for public couple photos all snapped into alignment. Elena was not hiding because she was ashamed. Elena was hiding because she was being coached, and coaching means there is an institution somewhere that benefits from silence. I lay in bed beside her and stared into the dark, listening to her breathing stay even, as if she could sleep because she believed she was safe. In the quiet, I realized the next phase could not be another private document collected in another private folder. Private proof is useful, but private proof does not collapse social scaffolding fast enough. If she had built her cover in public, then her consequences had to land in public, and they had to land clean. I closed my eyes and decided I would accept her next invitation, not to reconcile, but to choose the room where the first crack would become visible. When I finally drifted off, one thought stayed sharp and simple, because it fit too well to ignore. If Vivian Crow's name kept appearing in Elena's mouth, then Vivian was not background. Vivian was gravity, and gravity pulls everything down sooner or later. My week began to feel like a careful experiment where the subject refused to know he was being studied, because Elena had started measuring me the way a gambler measures a table. She watched for tells when I poured coffee, when I checked the mail, when I paused too long on a thought, and each time she found nothing, she rewarded herself with a little more confidence. Confidence is what people spend when they think they are winning, and I let her spend it. I smiled when she wanted a smile, I nodded when she wanted agreement, and I kept my hands steady even when my stomach turned. If she wanted to build a story about an unstable husband, then my first job was to be boringly stable. The building itself was doing its quiet work in the background because a condo is a glass box pretending to be private. I noticed how the elevator rides got slightly longer, not because the elevator changed, but because the silence inside it changed. Neighbors asked Elena how she was, then glanced at me as if checking whether I matched the answer. The doorman's politeness had hardened into a careful neutrality, like he did not want to be involved, but also did not want to be accused of ignoring what he might have seen. Even the package shelf felt like a stage now, because people hovered there with fake errands, pretending to browse labels while collecting impressions. No one said anything direct, but direct is rare in places where everyone shares walls. I understood why Elena had suddenly become so visible, because visibility is how you disinfect suspicion without addressing it. She offered to walk with me to the cafe. She suggested we try a new place for lunch, and she proposed small public routines that would leave a trail of normalcy. She wanted the building to remember us as intact, because intact is easier to defend than complicated. I agreed to some of it, because refusal would have looked like marital conflict, and conflict is a magnet for gossip. The whole point of my method was to let the truth arrive as a pattern, not as an accusation. Patterns survive gossip better than anger does, because patterns can be confirmed by people who want to stay neutral. The only person who had stepped out of neutrality was Mara Voss, and that was not a trivial decision on her part. She had warned me once, then again, and each time she kept it short and precise. There was no drama, no flirting, no attempt to turn the situation into entertainment, just factual timing that could be used later if the room needed a witness. I had been careful not to pull her deeper, because a witness who feels recruited becomes unreliable, and a witness who feels used becomes vengeful. Still, I needed one clean line from her, one sentence she could own without feeling trapped, because a case built entirely inside my phone could always be framed as a jealous man's obsession. A case that included one neutral observer became harder to dismiss. So on Tuesday evening, when I saw Mara in the hallway carrying a small grocery bag, I chose the moment the way you choose a pressure point. I did not approach her like a conspirator, and I did not lower my voice like I was trading secrets. I approached her like a neighbor who had a normal question, and I kept my posture relaxed, because tension invites interpretation. Mara looked at me with that composed face she always wore, the face that made other people feel slightly underdressed. She asked how my week was going in a tone that could pass for polite, but her eyes were sharper than her words. I told her it had been busy, and thanked her again for the heads up, and I asked if she would be comfortable giving me one brief summary of what she saw, in her own words, without embellishment. Mara did not hesitate, which told me she had already decided what she was willing to do. She stated the day and the approximate time she saw the man, and she described the entry in a simple way that avoided assumptions. She did not claim to know what happened inside, and she did not claim to know his name, because she was smart enough to stay inside observable reality. She added one detail that mattered, which was that Elena opened the door quickly and did not look surprised. I felt my spine tighten at that detail, but my face stayed neutral because this was not the moment for emotion. I thanked her and asked if she would be okay with me writing down her name and that single sentence as a witness note, in case the situation escalated into something administrative. She agreed, and she did not ask what kind of administration I meant, which told me she already suspected the direction this could go. I went back inside and wrote her name into my ledger on paper, not only in my phone, because paper looks like seriousness rather than paranoia. I wrote one sentence summary, dated it, and signed beneath it. Then I added a note that Mara did not claim anything beyond what she personally observed. The sentence was clean enough to be repeated later without embarrassment, and that was what I needed. I put the paper into a clear sleeve, because clear sleeves turn private pain into a document, and documents change the way people behave. Then I placed the sleeve in the same folder as the still frames and receipts, and I felt a strange calm settle into my chest. With that one line, the situation stopped being only my perception. It became a fact anchored in a neighbor's memory. The next morning, Elena mentioned that Mara had been friendly lately, and she said it with a brightness that did not fit the topic. I nodded and said Mara seemed polite, and I watched Elena's eyes flicker as if she was trying to measure whether Mara had said anything to me. Elena asked casually if Mara ever complained about hallway noise, and the question was too specific to be innocent. I kept my tone light, said I had not heard any complaints, and I changed the subject to a mundane errand. Elena smiled and let it go, but her shoulders stayed tight for a beat too long. That beat told me she was running risk calculations behind her expression. By Thursday, the pressure in the building had shifted from curiosity to judgment, because judgment is what follows curiosity when a pattern starts forming. A neighbor in the elevator mentioned seeing Elena out late recently, and he framed it as an admiring observation about how busy she must be. Elena laughed and said work had been demanding, and she glanced at me as if expecting me to confirm the excuse. I gave a mild nod, because I was not going to sabotage my own plan by looking cold in public. Still, I noticed the neighbor's eyes linger on Elena's phone when it buzzed. People notice phones now the way they used to notice wedding rings, because phones reveal what people hide. That afternoon, Elena suggested we host a family dinner on Sunday, as if she were rebuilding the home base from the inside out. She framed it as reconnecting, as showing everyone we were fine, as reminding ourselves we were still a team. The words sounded reasonable, but the timing sounded defensive, because defensive people love controlled environments. A family dinner in our apartment would give her the chance to perform normalcy in front of witnesses she cared about, and she could use their presence to restrain me if I ever asked questions. It was a clever move, and I respected it the way you respect a skilled opponent. I told her it sounded nice, and asked who she had in mind, and she listed a few relatives with a casual confidence that told me she expected me to comply. I agreed, because the dinner could serve my purpose as well as hers. Controlled environments can become traps if you bring the right documents and ask the right question at the right moment. I did not intend to humiliate her with theatrics, and I did not intend to create chaos for the sake of it. I intended to test her timeline in a room that remembered what was said, because family conversations have a way of becoming permanent in people's minds. If Elena lied in front of them, then her lie would gain witnesses, and witnesses change consequences. She did not realize she had offered me a stage. She believed she owned the stage, which is how people get hurt by their own confidence. Over the next 2 days, I prepared quietly, not with gadgets or tricks, but with paper. I printed the shared calendar week view that showed gaps where she claimed commitments, and I highlighted only one line that mattered. I printed the merchant alert summary showing the cafe charge near the building, and I circled the time window, keeping it clean and readable. I printed the doorbell still frame with the timestamp and placed it in a sleeve, and I made sure the image showed nothing beyond my doorway, because I did not want anyone to think I had been spying on the building. I stacked the sleeves in a folder that looked like ordinary household paperwork, because ordinary is what disarms suspicion. I did not rehearse speeches, because speeches invite argument. I rehearsed one neutral question that would force Elena to choose a date, because liars fear dates more than they fear anger. Elena continued her performance while I prepared, and she performed with a steady intensity that almost would have impressed me if it were not aimed at my life. She cooked more, cleaned more, suggested small jokes, and touched my arm in front of neighbors as if claiming territory. She mentioned Vivian Crow again in passing, like a protective charm she could hold up to make people hesitate. I listened and said little, because the more she used Vivian's name, the more it sounded like she was borrowing power rather than possessing it. Borrowed power always comes with a bill, and bills always arrive. On Saturday night, Elena's phone buzzed again while she was in the kitchen, and she angled the screen away as she swiped. I did not reach for anything, but I noticed her breathing shift, a tiny tightening that suggested she had received a message that changed her plan. A minute later, she announced she needed to run a quick errand in the morning, something about picking up supplies for dinner, and she said it with a casualness that felt rehearsed. I nodded and offered to go with her, and she declined too quickly, then softened the decline with a smile. The quick decline was the tell, because people who truly want supplies are glad for help. People who want a time window do not want help. After she fell asleep, I opened my ledger and added one more entry, the planned errand, the time she stated, and the fact that she declined company. I noted it without judgment because notes are not for rage, they are for structure. Then I checked the doorbell app and scrolled, not to spy, but to confirm whether any unusual triggers had occurred that day. Nothing appeared, which did not comfort me, because guilt often goes quiet right before it gets bold again. I placed the folder of sleeves into my work bag so it would not be visible around the apartment, and I set my alarm earlier than usual. If Elena wanted a private window on Sunday morning, then I wanted to know exactly when it opened and exactly when it closed. By Sunday morning, the apartment felt like a set built for two actors performing different plays. Elena moved around the kitchen preparing, humming softly, acting as if the dinner was a simple family event rather than a strategic show. I watched her, drank my coffee, and kept my tone mild. When she announced she was heading out for supplies, I told her to drive safe and asked what store she planned to hit first. She named a place without hesitation, and that confidence almost fooled me until I remembered that confidence can be scripted. She kissed my cheek and left, and the door closed, and the silence behind her felt like the pause before a trap snaps shut. I did not chase her, because chasing would be the same as admitting suspicion. I simply opened my phone, wrote down the exact time she left, and waited. If the lover came again, the doorbell would record it, and if he did not, then the absence would matter too. Either way, the dinner was coming, and with it, the first real test of whether Elena could keep her story intact when dates and documents entered the room. I sat at the table with the folder hidden in my bag, listening to the building's quiet noises, and I felt the strange certainty of a man who has stopped hoping and started counting. My phone showed the exact minute Elena left for her Sunday morning supplies, and I wrote it down like an accountant marking a discrepancy. I did not follow her because following turns a husband into a suspect, and suspects never control the story. I stayed home, washed a few dishes that were already clean, and let the apartment remain calm enough to feel believable. The building made its normal sounds through the walls, water running somewhere above, a distant door closing, the elevator cable humming faintly. Every ordinary noise felt like it was mocking me with the idea that life could still be normal. I checked the doorbell app once, then forced myself to wait because constant checking turns evidence into obsession. At 23 minutes after she left, the doorbell camera triggered, and the screen showed the familiar frame of my doorway. A tall figure stepped into view, broad shoulders filling the corner like a shadow with purpose. He did not look around the hall like a cautious visitor, and he did not hesitate like a man unsure of his welcome. He stood close enough to the door that the camera captured his posture clearly, and then my lock turned from the outside. The detail hit me harder than any kiss would have, because it meant he had access that did not require her presence. The door opened, he slipped inside, and the door shut again, and the timestamp sat there, bright and indifferent, like a judge who never sleeps. I did not shout, and I did not slam anything, because anger would not change what I had just watched. I saved the clip, took a still frame with the time visible, and sent the still to my own email with a clear subject line. I printed the still, wrote the date and minute on the back, and signed my initials with the same careful pressure. Then I took the clear sleeve folder from my bag and added the new page behind the others, because the sequence mattered more than my feelings. A man entering my home while my wife was out, using access she had given him, was not an affair detail. It was a violation that crossed into logistics and planning, the kind of behavior that tells you your life has been treated like an object. Elena returned an hour later with grocery bags and a bright expression that was supposed to read as domestic success. She talked about a crowded store, a missing ingredient, and a long line, and she looked at me as if asking whether I bought it. I listened and nodded, because I needed her to keep performing without realizing the stage had shifted. Her phone buzzed twice while she unpacked, and each time she flipped it face down as if the motion were natural. I offered to help chop vegetables, and she accepted with a warm smile that looked like relief. Relief is what people show when they think their cover is still intact. The rest of the afternoon moved in controlled preparation, the smell of cooking filling the apartment, the table being set with extra care. Elena put effort into small aesthetic details, folded napkins, wiped the counter twice, adjusted a centerpiece that did not need adjusting. She wanted the home to look stable, because stable is an argument in itself. I played my part by carrying plates and asking light questions about the menu. Under the surface, my mind was building the structure of the evening, deciding exactly when to apply pressure and exactly how much. Pressure works best when it feels like an accident of reality, not a choice of cruelty. Her relatives arrived first, then a couple of mine, and the room warmed with the usual polite friction of family life. People complimented Elena's cooking, asked me about work, mentioned small neighborhood news, as if nothing deeper could exist. I watched faces more than I watched hands, because faces hold the story people want to believe. Elena moved through the room like a practiced host, laughing at the right moments, touching shoulders, offering drinks with an ease that looked genuine. If someone had walked in cold, they would have assumed the marriage was fine. That assumption was part of her defense, and she had built it well. We sat down, and the clink of forks against plates created a rhythm that felt almost soothing. Elena spoke with confidence, telling everyone how busy work had been, how she had taken on new responsibilities, how leadership demanded flexibility. She mentioned the name Vivian Crow again, casually, like a badge she could flash if anyone questioned her schedule. People nodded, because powerful names discourage curiosity, and most families would rather respect a title than examine a timeline. I kept my expression mild and my tone dry, the way I always did when corporate life came up, because I needed them to see me as steady. A steady man asking a simple question sounds like reason, not revenge. Halfway through the meal, Elena described her morning errands in a neat sequence, as if she were laying down a path that could be repeated later. She mentioned leaving at a certain time, stopping at a specific store, then returning home, and she made it sound effortless. I waited a few minutes after she finished speaking, so it would not look like I was pouncing. Then I asked a single neutral question, phrased as mild curiosity about timing, because timing was the only thing that mattered. I asked what exact time she had returned to the building, since the store line had been so long. The question sounded harmless to everyone else, because people ask about errands all the time. To Elena, it was a trap door opening quietly under her feet. She answered quickly, and that quickness was the first crack. She gave a time that sounded plausible, and she smiled while she said it, as if smiling could make the time true. I nodded and followed with a second neutral detail question, the kind that makes a timeline real or makes it collapse. I asked whether she had used the front entrance or the side entrance with the loading ramp, because the grocery bags looked heavy. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then named the front entrance. The fraction of a second was small enough that a casual observer might miss it, but in a room that already had the faint scent of tension, it landed. My mother asked a light follow-up about the store being crowded, because mothers sense stress even when they pretend not to. Elena replied with a slightly different version of the morning sequence, adding a quick stop she had not mentioned before. It was an innocent mistake on the surface, the kind people make when they are telling a true story imperfectly. But I had watched enough dishonest people build alibis to know the difference between imperfect truth and layered fabrication. Layered fabrication always gets more detailed when questioned, because details are used as armor. Truth usually gets simpler because it does not need defense. I set my fork down and took a slow sip of water, giving the room time to settle into attention. Then I said I had been trying to update our shared household calendar for the week, and I wanted to make sure I understood her schedule. It was still a normal-sounding pretext, because couples talk about schedules all the time. I pulled out my phone and opened the exported calendar PDF, the one that showed the empty block during the exact hours she claimed errands and errands again. I did not shove it toward anyone, and I did not perform. I only angled it slightly so Elena could see the dates and the blank space, because I wanted the first confrontation to be between her and the document, not between her and me. Her face changed, but she tried to keep it subtle because she was in a room full of witnesses. She leaned in, glanced at the screen, then sat back with a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. She said something about not adding her work blocks to the shared calendar anymore, and she tried to make it sound like a normal update. I nodded as if that explanation could be reasonable, because I wanted her to commit to it. Then I asked, still calm, whether her late work blocks also explained why a visitor had entered our apartment while she was out. I phrased it as confusion, not accusation, because confusion forces people to explain themselves in a way that can be checked. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something private leaks into public air. Forks slowed, and even the small background music from Elena's speaker felt suddenly too loud. Elena's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed slightly, as if she was trying to decide whether to fight or charm. She said she did not know what I meant, and she looked around the table, as if searching for an ally in the faces of family. That was the second crack, because innocent people usually look straight at the person asking the question. People who are building a story look for witnesses to recruit. I did not raise my voice, and I did not accuse her of cheating, because those words would turn the moment into a debate about feelings. Instead, I reached into my bag, pulled out the plain folder, and placed it on the corner of the table without opening it. The folder looked like tax paperwork or a warranty packet, and that was intentional. I told her, in a steady tone, that the folder contained timestamps from our doorbell camera showing a tall man entering our home, including today, while she was not there. I did not describe anything beyond the entry because I refused to turn my family dinner into a crude spectacle. I only described the measurable fact, the time-stamped entry, because measurable facts are what end arguments. Elena's breathing changed, a small tightness that made her shoulders lift. She tried to laugh again, but the laugh came out thin, and she glanced at her phone as if it could rescue her. My father looked at me with a hard calm that told me he believed my restraint, and my mother's face tightened with disappointment rather than surprise. Elena's sister asked what man, and Elena answered too fast, saying there was no man, which only made her sister's eyes sharpen. The denials were coming in a rush now, and rush is what happens when a liar realizes the room has changed sides. I stayed silent long enough for her to feel the weight of her own words. Then Elena did what guilty people do when they cannot win on facts. She tried to shift the story to my state of mind, implying I had been stressed, implying I was misreading things, implying I was seeing threats that were not real. She tried to make my calm look like coldness, and my coldness look like obsession. It was almost impressive, because it was a familiar playbook executed with skill. The problem for her was that playbooks fail when paper enters the room. Paper does not care how charming you look, and it does not care what tone you use. I opened the folder just enough to slide out one clear sleeve, and I placed it on the table near Elena, not near anyone else. The sleeve showed the still frame with the timestamp and the outline of the man at our door. I did not push it into her hands, and I did not demand she admit anything. I simply let the evidence exist in the same space as her performance, because that was the whole point. The room leaned slightly, not dramatically, but enough that Elena noticed, because people always notice when attention shifts away from them. She stared at the sleeve, then stared at me, and for the first time that evening, her expression looked less like confidence and more like calculation. No one shouted, and no one threw anything, because the room had gone into a tense, controlled stillness. My relatives did not ask for details, because decent people hate details they cannot unhear. Elena's relatives looked at her with a mix of confusion and embarrassment, because they did not want their family name dragged into a public mess. Elena tried to speak again, but her words arrived slower now, careful, as if she were choosing which lie could survive documentation. I watched her eyes move between the sleeve, the faces, and my calm posture, and I realized she was not asking herself whether she could save the marriage. She was asking herself whether she could save the narrative. I folded the folder closed and said we should finish dinner without turning the table into a courtroom. I said the only reason I brought it up here was because she had asked for a family dinner, and she had presented her schedule as truth in front of everyone. I said I would not argue, but I would not accept a story that contradicted timestamps in my own home. I said it evenly, without insults, because insults would give her an emotional shield. The room stayed quiet, and Elena nodded once, a stiff movement that looked like agreement but felt like surrender. After dessert, people left earlier than usual, with polite hugs that felt like exits from a burning building. Elena's sister avoided eye contact, and my mother held my shoulder for a moment longer than normal, as if she were trying to communicate something without words. Elena helped clean up with exaggerated focus, stacking plates too carefully, wiping the same spot on the table twice. She did not cry, and she did not apologize, because apologies are admissions, and she was still trying to avoid admissions. When the last dish was in the rack, she turned toward me with an expression that tried to blend anger and innocence into one face. I looked back with the same calm I had used all week, and I waited. In the silence that followed, her phone buzzed again, and she flinched as if the sound had become a weapon. She reached for it, then hesitated, then reached again, and that hesitation was louder than any confession. I watched her thumb hover over the screen, and I realized she was choosing whether to answer her handler, her lover, or her rescue plan. The dinner had done what I needed it to do, because it made her lies public enough that she could not pretend nothing happened. Now she had witnesses, and witnesses change behavior fast. I let the moment stretch, because my method had always been the same: death by 1,000 truths, delivered calmly until the scaffolding collapses. Then she stepped toward the hallway as if she needed space, and I noticed she was carrying her phone like a shield. I stayed where I was and listened to her footsteps fade toward the bedroom. I did not chase her, because chasing would turn this into a fight she could later reframe. Instead, I opened my ledger, wrote down that the family dinner had introduced the first public witness layer, and noted the exact minute her phone buzzed afterward. I looked at the sleeve on the table and the calm emptiness of the room, and I felt something cold settle into certainty. If she was being coached, then tonight her coach would respond, and the response would expose the next link in the chain. My name is Graham Hale, and the silence after that dinner felt heavier than the worst shouting ever could. Elena retreated to the bedroom with her phone held close to her chest, like it was both a weapon and a life raft, and I stayed in the kitchen with the lights still on and the table still set like a stage nobody wanted to stand on. The apartment smelled like roasted food and lemon cleaner, and the mix made my stomach turn because it felt like domestic comfort trying to cover a crime scene. I stacked plates slowly, not because the plates mattered, but because slow movements keep the mind from sprinting into panic. The last guests had left with polite faces and stiff hugs, and those are the kinds of exits people remember. Witnesses do not need a confession to change their behavior, because discomfort is its own form of testimony. Elena did not come back out that night to apologize or to argue, which told me she was not thinking like a wife caught in a mistake. She was thinking like a person managing exposure, deciding which facts could be contained and which had already escaped. The buzzes from her phone had not stopped, and each buzz had made her shoulders tighten, like someone yanking a leash. I watched the time, wrote down the minute of the last buzz I heard through the thin hallway air, and then I put the folder of sleeves back into my bag. The folder was no longer only my private safety. It had become an object that carried social consequences, because family now knew something was wrong even if they refused to name it. That changed Elena's options, and it changed the lover's options, and it changed the options of anyone else who had been coaching her story. I slept lightly and woke before dawn, Not because I was energetic, but because my brain had shifted into the kind of alertness that comes after a controlled explosion. Elena was already awake when I stepped into the kitchen, and she had the blank expression of someone who has rehearsed calm in front of a mirror. She made coffee with steady hands, as if a steady hand could prove innocence, and she asked about my plans for the day with a mild tone that tried to sound normal. I answered with the same mildness and told her I had a full workload, because I wanted her to believe I was still operating inside routine. Routine was my camouflage, and it was also my trap. If she thought the dinner was the peak, she would move too quickly to patch the damage. Elena left the apartment earlier than usual, and she did not kiss me goodbye, which was a mistake, because people remember sudden changes. When the door closed behind her, I opened my laptop and logged into my work email, and I focused on actual tasks for the first hour. It mattered that I did my job, because professional stability is the simplest defense against the story of an unstable man. Around mid-morning, an internal notification popped up in my calendar system, and the subject line made my eyes go cold. It was an invite for a meeting with corporate HR, scheduled for that afternoon, with a bland title that tried to sound routine. It was addressed to me and Elena, and one other name I recognized as Vivian Crow's assistant, which meant Vivian's presence was either direct or implied. Meetings like that do not happen by accident, and they do not happen quickly unless someone is trying to control a narrative before it spreads. I did not forward the invite, and I did not ask Elena about it, because I wanted her to walk into that room believing she still had control. I took a screenshot of the invite details, making sure the subject line, the time, and the participant list were visible. Then I saved the screenshot into my evidence folder and labeled it with the date and minute, because the moment HR touches a story, the story becomes a record problem. I printed the screenshot as well, because paper survives phone failures, and paper looks serious in rooms that want to pretend everything is casual. I slipped the printout into a sleeve, added it to the folder, and took a breath that felt like swallowing ice. When Elena came home for lunch, she acted as if nothing unusual was happening, which told me she knew the meeting was coming and intended to treat it as routine. She mentioned she might have to stay late because leadership had tightened expectations, and she said it with the same polished tone she used at the dinner when she flashed Vivian's name like a shield. I nodded and asked whether she wanted leftovers for lunch, because mundane questions create contrast. The contrast mattered, because it would make her later claims of chaos look less believable. She ate quickly, checked her phone twice, and left with a brief glance at me that was not affection and not anger, but measurement. It was the look of someone trying to decide whether you are still predictable. I went into the office early because I wanted to arrive before the narrative did. The hallways were bright and sterile, and the air smelled like recycled ventilation and cheap citrus cleaner, the kind that promises cleanliness without delivering comfort. People greeted me with their usual professional friendliness, but I noticed slight pauses, slight shifts in posture, the subtle signs of a rumor traveling ahead of its proof. In corporate spaces, rumors move like smoke, and HR behaves like a fire marshal, not because they care about truth, but because they care about liability. I sat at my desk and worked steadily, answering messages and closing tasks, because competence is a shield. When I stood to refill my water bottle, I noticed someone watching me from the end of the corridor, a woman I recognized from HR operations, her expression neutral in the way HR neutrality always feels like a threat. Owen Kerr, a co-worker who kept his head down and his opinions locked away, stopped by my desk mid-morning and asked if I had time for a quick check-in. Owen was not my friend, but he was a reliable observer, the type who notices patterns and does not exaggerate. I followed him to a quieter corner near a conference room, and he asked, in careful language, whether I was okay. He did not ask about Elena directly, which told me he had heard something, but did not want to be seen as spreading it. I told him I was fine and that I preferred to keep my work clean, and I watched his eyes register the answer. Owen then mentioned that Vivian Crow had requested certain files be reviewed for compliance, and he said it as if he were talking about a weather change. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, and the mention of Vivian confirmed what my instincts had been building all week. The affair was not just a private betrayal, it was entangled with power. I asked Owen a simple question about what kind of compliance review this was, and he answered with a careful summary that avoided speculation. He said HR had been reminding teams about disclosure rules and conflicts, and he said it in the tone of someone repeating a memo line. He also said the reminder felt targeted, not general, because certain managers had been asked to acknowledge receipt in writing. That last detail mattered, because written acknowledgments are how institutions prepare for consequences. I thanked him for the heads up and returned to my desk, with my mind already building the shape of the afternoon. If HR was tightening compliance language, it meant they anticipated a policy breach landing in the open. Elena and her lover were not just risking my marriage, they were risking the company's clean story, and companies punish risks when risks threaten power. When the meeting time arrived, I walked to the HR floor with a calm pace, carrying nothing visible but my laptop bag. I kept the evidence folder inside the bag because I was not there to put my marriage on display in a corporate hallway. I was there to force the story into recordable reality because recordable reality is the only thing HR respects. The HR conference room was glass-walled with frosted stripes designed to look transparent while still hiding everything that matters. Elena was already inside when I arrived, sitting with her shoulders set and her face composed like she had practiced the posture. Across from her sat Vivian Crow, the kind of executive who looks like she has never been surprised in her life, and beside Vivian sat an HR representative with a laptop open and hands poised, ready to type history into existence. Vivian greeted me with a polite professionalism that felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. She framed the meeting as a routine check to ensure workplace conduct standards were understood and followed, and she spoke as if she were protecting the institution from inconvenience. Elena nodded at the right moments, playing the role of the valued employee being guided, not the spouse hiding a schedule. I listened without interrupting, because letting power speak first reveals what power is afraid of. Vivian referenced company reputation, team morale, and the need for clear boundaries, and she said it all without mentioning any specific accusation. That kind of vagueness is intentional, because vagueness gives them flexibility to punish whoever becomes most convenient. The HR rep then confirmed that the meeting would be documented as a compliance discussion, and that documentation was the hinge of the room. Once documentation begins, denials have to compete with paper, and paper does not blink. I asked a single clarifying question about whether the company's policy required disclosure of intimate relationships that could create conflicts of interest, and my tone stayed neutral. Vivian answered that disclosure was required when power dynamics existed, and she emphasized power dynamics the way a person emphasizes a threat. Elena's eyes flicked toward me, and I could see the calculation behind her expression because she realized I was not here to plead. I was here to align her choices with policy language. I reached into my bag and pulled out one sleeve, not the whole folder, and I placed it on the table with the same calm I used when submitting a claim file. The sleeve held the printed HR invite screenshot, and the doorbell still, and the merchant alert summary, arranged as a simple timeline page I had prepared that morning. I did not narrate it with emotion, and I did not accuse anyone of anything physical. I simply stated that there was documented evidence of a tall male visitor entering my home multiple times, including while my wife was out, and that the timing overlapped with her claimed work obligations and her receipt-linked spending. I stated that I was not asking HR to adjudicate my marriage, but I was asking HR to acknowledge the possibility of a conflict tied to workplace conduct and narrative control. The room went colder, not in temperature, but in tone, because Vivian's power depends on controlling which facts become official. Elena tried to speak, but Vivian held up a hand, and that gesture told me more than Elena's words ever could. Vivian was not protecting Elena. Vivian was protecting the institution's ability to choose its outcome. The HR rep glanced at the sleeve, then at Vivian, then back to the laptop, and I could see the moment when the story moved from private scandal to compliance risk. Vivian asked, in a calm voice, whether the visitor could be verified as connected to the workplace, and I answered that I did not claim a name, only documented entry and timing. That answer mattered because it kept me inside lawful fact and away from speculation. Speculation is where they bury you. The HR rep asked for copies of the documentation, and I slid the sleeve forward without hesitation, because this was exactly what I wanted. Evidence received by HR becomes a record problem, and record problems force action within days, not months. Vivian's face remained composed, but her eyes sharpened slightly, the way they do when a chess piece lands somewhere unexpected. Elena's face had changed too, losing some of its polish, because she understood that the narrative was no longer hers to manage alone. The HR rep typed a case reference line into the system, then read the case ID aloud for the room, because that is how institutions mark the start of consequences. The meeting ended quickly after that, not because the issue was resolved, but because Vivian wanted control back. Elena left the room first, moving fast, phone already in her hand, and I watched her shoulders tense as if she were bracing for impact. Vivian lingered a moment, looking at me as if deciding whether I was a threat or a nuisance, and I gave her the same calm expression I would give an adjuster trying to intimidate a claimant. Then I walked out into the hallway and felt the office air hit my lungs like a chemical. The rumor spiral that had been smoke would now become heat, because HR had logged a case, and people sense logged cases even when they do not know the details. As I returned to my desk, my phone buzzed with a new notification, a system email confirming the HR case reference and the meeting documentation. I saved it, printed the header, and added it to the folder because the story was now moving on official tracks. My method had always been simple: death by 1,000 truths, delivered lawfully until the scaffolding collapses. Today, the scaffolding had begun to crack in a room built for control, and Elena no longer had the option of pretending this was only a private misunderstanding. Now it was a record, and records are the one thing power cannot flirt with or cry at. By the time I reached home that evening, the building felt less like a residence and more like a corridor of opinions that had learned my wife's name. The elevator doors opened onto our floor with their usual soft chime, yet the air in the hallway carried a different weight, because people sense when a private fire has been reported to an official department. I walked at the same pace I always walked, with the same posture and the same bored face, because nothing invites punishment faster than a man who looks like he wants revenge. When I unlocked my door, I noticed Elena's shoes were not by the entryway, which meant she had either left again or she had decided to hide in the bedroom like a wounded executive. Either option was a tell, because hiding is not what innocent people do when their husband attends a routine HR meeting. Elena appeared from the hallway with her phone already in her hand, and her expression was polished into something that tried to blend anger with injured dignity. She did not ask what I had done, because she already knew, and she did not ask why I had done it, because the answer was sitting in my folder like a quiet judge. She went straight to the point by trying to reframe the day as my overreaction, my control issue, my inability to trust, and she did it with the smooth confidence of someone repeating lines that have been tested before. I listened without interrupting, because interruptions let liars claim you are volatile, and volatility is the easiest label to paste onto a man who refuses to be humiliated quietly. When she paused for breath, I asked one neutral question about whether she wanted the HR case number to remain the only record, or whether she planned to introduce her own version to protect herself. The question sounded administrative on purpose, because administrative language denies her the comfort of emotional theater. Her eyes narrowed at the word record, and I watched the exact moment she realized the playing field had changed. She had been managing gossip, managing family impressions, managing neighbor optics, and now she had to manage minutes, which cannot be seduced or guilted into forgetting. She said her work life was complicated, and she implied that I did not understand how leadership pressure worked, which was rich coming from someone who had been opening my door for a stranger. I told her I understood pressure perfectly, because pressure is what makes people reveal what they value, and she had valued secrecy over marriage without even breaking stride. That was not a speech, and it was not a confession demand, because I refused to grant her a dramatic narrative. It was only the simplest observation, delivered like a file note, and it made her face tighten like she had been slapped with paperwork. She moved toward the kitchen counter and began cleaning an already clean surface, which was her favorite way of pretending she was calm. I watched her hands, because hands betray nerves long before mouths do, and her fingers kept tapping her phone screen as if she were waiting for instructions. I asked whether Vivian Crowe had told her to expect the meeting, and Elena's answer came too quickly, which meant she had rehearsed a denial. She said the meeting was normal, and she said Vivian was only being cautious, and she said my evidence was out of context because out of context is the phrase people use when context is exactly what kills them. I nodded as if I accepted the explanation, because acceptance is how you get the next detail. Then I asked what Kellen's role in her team was, and I watched her blink once, sharply, as if her brain had to decide whether I was guessing or I already knew. That blink was the first honest moment I had seen from her in weeks, and it landed harder than a confession would have. Elena tried to mask it with a scoff, then with a small laugh, then with a story about vendors and project timelines that sounded respectable if you did not know the timestamps. I did not accuse her of sleeping with a specific man, and I did not describe what the doorbell clips implied beyond entry, because I was not trying to win an argument in my own kitchen. I was trying to force her to admit the shape of the operation, because the operation was what would trigger consequences inside 30 days. Elena finally said Kellen had been assigned to support a project under Vivian's oversight, and she framed it as purely professional, the kind of phrase that always arrives right before the phrase boundaries got blurred. I let the silence stretch, because silence is the one tool that makes polished people feel exposed. What changed next was not her story, but her tone, because her tone shifted from marital defense to corporate damage control. She said that whatever I thought I saw, I had now created a situation that could impact her career, and she implied I would be responsible for the fallout. That was the moment I understood the affair was not a romance wrapped in secrecy, but a career ladder wrapped in desire. She did not mention love, and she did not mention mistakes, and she did not mention regret, because her real fear was not losing me. Her real fear was losing the trajectory she had been climbing, and I could almost admire the clarity if it were not built on my doorstep. I told her calmly that she had created the situation the moment she gave access to someone who entered our home without her present. She stared at me as if she wanted me to flinch, because flinching would give her power, and I gave her nothing but a flat patience. That night she slept in the bedroom with the door closed, and I slept on the couch with my phone face up, not because I feared violence, but because I feared spin. Around midnight, an email arrived from HR confirming the case file had been opened and that further review would be scheduled, and the subject line was the kind that looks harmless until it ruins a reputation. I saved the email header, printed it, and added it to the folder, because every official line that exists makes it harder for Vivian to pretend this is a private misunderstanding. In the early hours, Elena's phone buzzed repeatedly behind the closed bedroom door, and each buzz sounded less like romance and more like crisis coordination. When morning came, She emerged with her makeup perfect and her eyes slightly hollow, like she had slept just enough to keep her face usable in meetings. She poured coffee and spoke in short, controlled sentences that tried to sound like truce, which told me she was preparing for another room full of witnesses. The next few days proved what I already suspected, because the workplace rumor spiral arrived on schedule like a train you can hear before you see it. Owen stopped by my desk and told me, in careful language, that Vivian had instructed managers to keep discussions professional and contained, which is corporate code for the story is leaking. Another co-worker asked if everything was okay at home, and she did it with a smile that tried to look caring while collecting information. I responded with a dry joke about busy seasons and deadlines, because jokes are camouflage, and camouflage buys time. At lunch, I saw Elena across the cafeteria with Vivian, and Elena's posture was slightly angled toward Vivian like a subordinate seeking shelter. Vivian's posture, meanwhile, was perfectly upright and perfectly detached, like a person who believes she can move people around without leaving fingerprints. That afternoon, Elena sent me a message asking if we could talk, and the politeness of it would have been almost funny if my doorbell footage did not exist. I agreed to talk at home, not in public, because I did not want to give her a stage for tears. When she sat across from me at the dining table, she did not apologize, and she did not confess, and she did not ask what I wanted. Instead, she asked what I planned to do next, and she asked it like a negotiator, asking whether the other side has ammunition. I told her I planned to protect my life from becoming her collateral, and I planned to do it through civil channels, because civil channels are the only ones that produce binding schedules. She said I was overreacting again, but her voice was thinner now, and thin voices belong to people who feel the floor moving under them. I told her I was scheduling mediation, and I said it without menace, because mediation is a bland word with sharp consequences. She tried to bargain by offering transparency, offering therapy, offering a fresh start, offering anything that would keep the story inside our walls. It was almost pathetic, because weeks earlier she had wanted visibility to build her shield, and now she wanted privacy to contain her collapse. I told her transparency was not an offer that could arrive after documented entry, and therapy was not a substitute for a timeline that could survive in court. I said I would not turn this into a screaming match, and I would not chase her phone or her secrets, because chasing is a young man's mistake. I said the only thing that mattered now was what could be documented cleanly and resolved logically within 30 days. She stared at me with a mix of hatred and fear, because I had removed the emotional battlefield she had trained for. In that moment, I realized she had expected me to explode, and my calm had become the problem she could not spin. Within the week, I received a mediation confirmation with a date and time, and I saved it and printed it, because a scheduled appointment becomes an anchor in a storm. Elena tried to delay it by claiming her work calendar was impossible, and she invoked Vivian's name again like a threat, saying leadership needed her, and this could ruin everything. I asked her whether leadership also needed a man entering our home while she was out, and I asked it without raising my voice, because the truth does not need volume. She did not answer that question, because answering it would force her to admit she had allowed a logistical breach, not a romantic mistake. Instead, she said she felt trapped, and the irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. She had trapped herself, and now she wanted me to pretend the cage was mine. The next twist arrived quietly, as twists often do because real life hates dramatic music. Mara texted me a short note saying she had seen the tall man again, not at my door this time, but in the building lobby speaking briefly with a woman in a suit who matched the executive type. Mara did not name the woman, and she did not invent motives because she was careful, but she described the posture and the sharp gestures of someone giving instructions. I felt something click into place, because it confirmed what Elena's tone had already revealed. The lover was not just a lover, and Elena was not just a cheater. They were parts of a managed story, and Vivian's shadow was inside it. I wrote down Mara's message, saved the timestamp, and stared at my folder as if it were suddenly too small for what the truth was becoming. That night, Elena received another call in the bedroom, and her voice rose just enough for me to hear a clipped cadence, not emotional, but operational. When she came out later, her face looked harder, and she told me Vivian wanted this handled quietly for everyone's benefit. The phrase everyone's benefit sounded like a threat wrapped in concern, and it made my blood run colder. I nodded as if I accepted the idea of quiet, because quiet is exactly where my method thrives. Then I asked Elena one final question before she could retreat again, and I asked it like a man signing a file. I asked whether she had chosen Kellen or whether Vivian had chosen him for her. Elena froze for half a breath, and that half breath told me the answer was worse than cheating. When she finally spoke, she did not deny it, and she did not confirm it, because ambiguity was her last shelter. She only said I did not understand how things worked at her level, and she walked away with her phone held like a badge. I sat at the table and added a new line to the ledger, marking the shift from personal betrayal to institutional manipulation. I looked at the mediation confirmation and the HR case header and the doorbell stills, and I felt the shape of the endgame sharpening. If Vivian had been managing the narrative, then the only way to beat her was to force the narrative into a public record she could not edit. I closed the folder, set it beside my keys, and realized the next arena could not be our home or HR's glass room. The next arena had to be a room where minutes were typed live in front of witnesses who did not answer to her. The next morning, I did not go hunting for romance, because romance was never the engine here, and I went hunting for logs, because logs are where institutions hide their fingerprints. I took the folder from my bag, slid out only the doorbell still from Sunday morning, and stared at the detail that had bothered me most since I saw it, which was the lock turning before Elena returned home. A visitor with access is not a lover's convenience, it is a system decision, and system decisions always leave paperwork somewhere boring. I started with the only place that could grant access without breaking a window, which was the building's management office, and I chose a time when the lobby was busy enough to keep the interaction routine. I walked downstairs with a neutral face, nodded at the doorman like nothing in my life was on fire, and crossed the lobby toward the small glass door marked Management. The assistant behind the desk recognized me, and recognition matters because it makes later denials harder. I asked for a copy of our unit's key access record for the last month, framing it as a security concern after unusual activity near our door. I said it calmly, because calm sounds like responsibility, and responsibility makes people cooperate. The assistant hesitated, then gave me the corporate smile reserved for requests that could become problems. She told me she could not hand over logs casually, because policy required a written request, and she offered to email the property manager to schedule a review. I agreed, because written requests are exactly what I wanted, and I asked her to send the email while I stood there, because delay is where records get edited. She typed, asked me to confirm my address, and I watched the subject line appear on her screen like a small building block in my case. I took out my phone and, without making it theatrical, photographed the email subject line and timestamp as it appeared on her monitor, because that moment proved I initiated the record cleanly. Within an hour, the property manager replied with a scheduled review time for the next day, and the email carried that faint corporate warmth that feels friendly until you realize it is liability management. I saved the email header, printed it, and added it to the folder beside the HR case confirmation, because this was the second institution forced into daylight. Elena came home later with her face set like a woman walking into a meeting she had already lost. She asked where I had been, and I answered with a simple line about errands, because I did not owe her my calendar anymore. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it too fast, and the little ritual told me she was still receiving instructions. That night she tried to reframe the situation as a mutual misunderstanding that could be resolved privately through compromise. She suggested we pause mediation, pause records, pause everything, because pauses help liars rebuild their scaffolding. I told her, evenly, that pauses were for people who had not already turned my front door into a shared resource. She stared at me like she wanted me to break, because a broken man makes a better villain. I did not break, and I did not chase her into the bedroom when she withdrew, because chasing is an admission of weakness, and I had none left to spare. The next day, I attended the key log review at the management office, and I arrived early with my folder inside my bag, not in my hands. The property manager greeted me with professional sympathy, the kind that never commits to believing you. He opened a binder and pulled up a digital record on his screen. Then he asked what dates concerned me. I gave him the exact time window from Sunday morning and watched his eyes flick across the entries as he scrolled. People can hide opinions, but their eyes betray surprise before their mouths catch up. He pointed to a line item that made my throat tighten because it showed a master key release for my unit during the precise window Elena was out. The entry listed a reason that looked harmless, something about a brief inspection for a reported leak concern. The request name on the line was mine, attached to a phone number that was not my number. I felt a cold clarity settle in, because this was not only infidelity anymore, it was identity used as a tool. The property manager explained that these requests often came through a third-party vendor coordination channel, and he sounded defensive before I said a word, which told me he already sensed danger. I asked him to print the relevant page and stamp it as reviewed, because printed pages are harder to wish away later. He hesitated, then complied, and the office assistant placed the sheet into a clear sleeve and stamped the corner with a simple received mark. I photographed the stamped sleeve on the desk beside the office clock, because timestamps are my religion now. Then I asked, in a calm tone, for the name of the person who authorized the key release, because authorization is where the truth starts. He answered that the authorization came from the building's security contractor contact, a name I recognized from a lobby placard, the kind of vendor label people stop noticing after a week. As I walked out of the management office, I felt the second twist settle into my bones with a grim satisfaction. Elena had not merely invited a man into our home, she had participated in a process that used my identity to grant access, which meant someone with power was manufacturing plausible deniability. This was the kind of move designed to make me look paranoid if I complained, because the record would show my name on the request. It was elegant in a cruel way, like a chess move that sacrifices a pawn to trap a king. And it carried Vivian's scent all over it, because only someone comfortable with systems would think to weaponize a log. I returned to the office for the afternoon, and I did not tell anyone what I had found, because I wanted the record to speak before the rumor did. HR sent a follow-up note requesting additional documentation, and the note contained a line that confirmed the case had been escalated for review. I saved the email, printed the header, and added it to the folder. Then I updated my ledger with a new category, Building Access Manipulation. Owen crossed my desk area with the careful gait of a man trying not to be seen in the wrong conversation. He told me quietly that Vivian was holding closed-door check-ins and asking managers to document their compliance understanding in writing, which meant she was building her own safety net. When Elena got home that evening, she saw the management office stamp sleeve on the table before I could hide it, because I wanted her to see it. Her face changed in a way I had not seen before, because this was not a doorbell clip that could be mocked as misread. This was a log with my name on a request I never made, and it turned her strategy into a crime of narrative, even if it stayed civil. She tried to speak, then stopped, then tried again, and her throat worked like it was swallowing a hard pill. She said the building must have mixed something up, then she said she had no idea, then she shifted to anger, because anger is where people run when fear becomes too naked. I kept my voice flat and asked whether she wanted to claim she had no idea a master key was used, because claiming ignorance would force her to explain why she was comfortable with the visitor entering while she was out. She accused me of setting traps, and the accusation almost made me smile, because traps were exactly what she and Vivian had been setting for weeks. I told her calmly that the record showed my identity was used to authorize access, and I asked who gave Vivian the idea to do that, because this was no longer a husband question. Elena's eyes flicked toward her phone, and that flick told me the answer was connected to the buzzing leash. For the first time, Elena's performance cracked into something closer to honesty, though it arrived in fragments rather than confession. She admitted that Vivian had been involved, not in the way a boss is involved in a schedule, but in the way a handler is involved in a story. She admitted that Vivian had warned her about disclosure and optics, and had offered to protect her career if she kept the situation contained. She admitted that Kellen was not just a fling, but a convenient piece, someone who could be positioned and removed, depending on what Vivian needed. Then she tried to soften it by saying she felt pressured, as if pressure turns choices into accidents. That admission gave me the full shape of the second twist, and it was uglier than simple cheating because it treated my life as a prop in a power game. Elena had not been protecting love. She had been protecting leverage. Vivian had not been protecting policy. She had been protecting herself. And Kellen, whoever he was, had been moving through my home like a man who believed the system belonged to him. I did not shout, because shouting would only make Elena retreat into victim language. I simply told her that the next step would happen in a room where minutes were typed live, because typed minutes cannot be seduced. The mediation confirmation was already on my calendar, but I upgraded it by requesting an on-record session with a neutral facilitator who would document refusals and inconsistencies. I sent the request by email, saved the sent header, and printed it, because every step needed a receipt now. Elena tried to stall, claiming work obligations and leadership demands, and she invoked Vivian again like a protective spell. I asked Elena whether Vivian had authorized the master key request under my name, and Elena's silence answered more loudly than her words ever could. Silence in the face of a log is an admission by default, because there is nowhere clean for it to hide. 2 days later, I received a notice that the mediator would document the session summary and could note any refusal to answer a simple timeline question. That line mattered more than all the emotional negotiations Elena had attempted, because it meant a neutral person would become the witness, and neutral witnesses are what power fears. The building's gossip wave intensified as neighbors started avoiding Elena's eyes, and as the doorman's politeness became cold. Elena tried to counter it by being more visible, but visibility had turned against her because people could sense desperation the way they sense smoke. Mara texted me a brief note saying Elena had been crying in the lobby while on the phone, and that Vivian had arrived in a car and spoken to her sharply, then walked away without looking back. That image was the final confirmation I needed, because it showed Elena was not the partner Vivian protected. She was the liability Vivian managed. The affair had been a tool, and tools get discarded when they become noisy. I updated my ledger that night with one simple line: handler moved to containment stage. Then I prepared my folder for the mediation session by narrowing it down to 3 clean items that could not be argued into feelings. The doorbell still showing entry and timestamp, the management key release log showing my name used fraudulently, and the HR case header showing evidence received and escalated review. Those 3 pieces formed a chain from home to institution to record, and a chain is what breaks scaffolding. On the eve of mediation, Elena asked for one private talk, and her voice finally sounded tired instead of polished. She did not ask me to forgive her for betrayal. She asked me to stop humiliating her, which revealed what she truly valued. I told her humiliation was not my goal, and record truth was. I told her the only way this ended cleanly was if she stopped letting Vivian write her sentences. Elena's mouth tightened, and she looked at her phone again like it was the only door left in a burning building. As she walked back toward the bedroom, I realized she was not planning to arrive at mediation as a cooperative spouse, but as an employee following instructions. I sat at the table with the folder closed in front of me, listening to the building settle into nighttime quiet. The mediation room would not be my final arena, but it would be the room where the last safe lies ran out. And if Vivian tried to contain this with private pressure, then tomorrow would force her to choose between protecting herself and sacrificing Elena on the record. I checked the time, wrote down the minute, and felt the approach of the next set piece like footsteps in a hallway, steady, confident, and impossible to ignore. The mediation room was smaller than Elena expected, which was the first quiet punishment, because small rooms do not allow grand performances. The table was plain, the chairs were identical, and the facilitator sat at the head with a laptop already open, fingers resting on the keyboard like a judge waiting for facts instead of feelings. Elena arrived with her phone in her hand and her posture tight, and she glanced around as if searching for Vivian's shadow before sitting down. I took my seat without greeting her, not out of cruelty, but because greetings imply negotiation, and this was no longer a negotiation. The facilitator explained the rules in a calm voice, emphasizing that the session summary would be typed live and stored on record, including any refusals to answer direct timeline questions. When the facilitator asked Elena to confirm the date and time of her Sunday morning errand, Elena answered carefully, choosing a version that sounded safe. The facilitator typed as she spoke, and the clicking keys filled the room like a metronome counting lies. I was then asked whether I had documentation that contradicted the stated timeline, and I slid one sleeve across the table without commentary. The doorbell still showed the timestamp of entry, clean and undeniable, and the facilitator paused just long enough for the weight of it to settle before typing evidence received. Elena tried to explain, then stopped, because explanations die when they hit timestamps. The facilitator asked a second question about building access, and I placed the stamped key release log on the table, the one showing my identity used to authorize entry while I was away. Elena stared at the paper as if it had grown teeth, and for the first time she did not try to charm or deflect. The facilitator asked whether Elena denied the use of the master key, and Elena said she did not know, which the facilitator typed as refusal to confirm. The room felt colder then, not emotionally, but procedurally, because procedures are how consequences begin. I was asked whether this access had been disclosed to me beforehand, and I answered no, and the word no landed harder than any accusation. The facilitator summarized aloud, reading back the typed lines, and each line stripped another layer of protection from Elena's story. When asked whether the visitor had any professional connection that created a conflict, Elena hesitated too long, then said she could not answer that question today. The facilitator typed, refused to answer, and that phrase sealed the session like wax. I did not smile and I did not look at Elena, because this was not a victory lap. This was the end of her ability to pretend the damage was private. The facilitator closed the laptop, confirmed the summary would be shared with counsel and relevant parties, and ended the session with a neutral thank you. Outside the room, Elena finally spoke my name, but her voice had lost its edge. She did not ask for forgiveness, and she did not threaten me with Vivian anymore, because the record had made Vivian irrelevant. I told Elena the truth quietly, that I had never wanted to destroy her, only to stop being used as cover for people who thought my life was expendable. She looked at me like she wanted to say something meaningful, but meaning had been outsourced too long to be retrieved now. I walked out alone, folder under my arm, and felt the strange calm that comes when a lie collapses under its own paperwork. The affair had ended not with shouting or tears, but with minutes, timestamps, and refusals typed into a system that did not care who she slept with. And that was the only ending that ever could have worked, because institutions do not fear rage. They fear records that cannot be edited.